think what's really cool about these scribe technologies, where they basically listen in on the visits and then use these AI models to summarize those visits and kind of write the notes, is they're the first technology I've seen that really can solve that dream of getting the doctor out of focusing on the computer and into focusing more directly on the patient.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
We are excited to sit down with Jacob Effron, a partner at Redpoint Ventures. Jacob was a product manager at Flatiron Health before joining Redpoint post-MBA in San Francisco. In addition to investing, Jacob hosts 2 podcasts, Unsupervised Learning and Vital Signs. Now, as an early growth investor at Redpoint, Jacob has a passion for all things related to healthcare and AI. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks so much for having me on. Excited to be here.
Excited to have you. So let's start post-college. You were a business analyst at McKinsey for 2 years before going to Tanzania. So what led you to East Africa?
When I was at McKinsey, I got really interested in economic development and actually did a bunch of work in East Africa. We were looking at different technologies that were being adopted and how they might increase access to different essential services. And while I was there, I got exposed to what was happening in off-grid solar, which was just fascinating. I mean, basically, the price of solar had come down to the point where it was actually cost competitive with kerosene if you financed it over a 3-year period of time. And what that allowed is solar energy is obviously much cleaner for the world. It's way cleaner for households than kerosene is, but it has all sorts of, kerosene is really unreliable. It oscillates with oil prices. And so the opportunity that cheaper solar presented was fascinating. And then I had kind of become convinced at that point that like startups and social enterprises were the way to really have the most impact. And so to be able to go over there, I moved out and joined a business that was basically selling these small systems that would do 3 lights, a phone charger, and a radio, and then financing them over 3 years. So probably the most interesting startup I'll ever work for, but just a really cool business and one that I was really excited about the mission.
And very different than your next role because you joined Flatiron Health for 2 years before Roche acquired the company. And you're a product manager there. And we haven't actually dove into like the product manager role on the podcast yet. So what exactly did that role entail? Because I've noticed a bit of product managers transitioning to the VC side, like post-operator.
Yeah. So I mean, there was like 3 major parts of the role, right? The first was figuring out like what customers want and what customers need. And so a lot of that is talking to customers, embedding yourself with customers. We used to go visit cancer centers all the time and just sit next to people, see what their workflows were and what they were doing, and talk to them about what they were doing and why, and just kind of learn from there what products might be helpful to build. The second was really kind of working with a team of engineers, designers to actually build those features and figure out, as a product manager, your job is basically to just unblock everyone else on the team and make sure that those things can be shipped and built. And then the third part is really, making sure those are rolled out successfully. And obviously all this is done in collaboration with lots of folks, but a feature is only so useful as it actually gets used. And so making sure that working with product marketing on how it's communicated to folks, tracking whether it's actually doing what you thought it would do, making sure your team is committed to fixing things as they come up. It's kind of how I describe it at a high level. Really, it was a lot of fun.
Okay, so a lot of managing of people and workflows, which are definitely similarities to what we do today as an investor. How did that experience shape your investing expertise today?
First and foremost, it just gave me a lot of empathy for folks who are building products and companies. It's really hard. It was really powerful just to, was one of the first things that got me excited about the whole space, because you get to see from just an idea to something actually getting in customers' hands. And it's just incredibly rewarding and powerful and energizing. It got along the way. There are so many things that come up, and hopefully it's given me just a tremendous amount of empathy for how difficult it is to do a lot of these things. And so I try to keep that in mind every time we're talking with companies or working with our own portfolio companies.
And then around 4 years ago, you started as an investor at Redpoint. So maybe let's just touch on Redpoint's investing strategy and how you landed there. I mean, great fund with a great brand name and some impressive investments.
So I was really lucky to land at Redpoint. Redpoint really invests in generational companies across a bunch of spaces. I mean, the core focus of the fund traditionally has been B2B software and data infrastructure. We make great investments in fintech and healthcare and consumer. as I thought about what got me excited, it was really these like generational companies that were like changing the world. And Redpoint not only partners with those companies, but I think does a great job of just rolling up the sleeves and just being super involved in the set of companies we work with. And so I knew from the outset it was a fund I was super excited about and drawn to. And I mean, even just some of the portfolio companies that the fund had worked with, whether it was Snowflake or Twilio or HashiCorp or Stripe, or in healthcare like a Cityblock or Nubank and fintech. There's just such an interesting set of companies. And ultimately, I think when you're joining a fund, you're joining a team. In the case of our early growth fund, it's a team of 7 people. It's not a huge team. In kind of getting to know the folks on the team, I just became confident. It was an incredible place to get to learn the craft of investing, to work with some of the best folks out there, with some of the best companies out there.
And you also have a unique media angle at Redpoint. I mean, on top of your focus with the 2 podcasts, your colleagues also have very thoughtful pieces that they put out in the ecosystem, podcasts, written posts, TV appearances, etc. What edge do you think that gives your fund, and how important is to have some media presence or like voice in this like noisy landscape that we're all in?
Totally. I mean, one thing I love about venture is there's no one way to do the job. Obviously, it's a strategy that we found works really well. I don't think it's like a prerequisite to investing right now. I think what it does for us is a few things. One, it definitely just helps kind of get our name out there. You always want to be top of mind for founders, the first call they make when they're thinking about building a company or raising a certain round. And so I think just awareness of who we are at Redpoint, the kinds of things we're interested in, it's kind of like putting up a bat signal to the world and being like, here's the spaces we spend time in, here's the things we're excited about.
I'm here to help.
Yeah, here's the hopefully that draws in people that are also excited about those things. It hopefully does a good job of conveying that we're pretty serious about the spaces we spend time in, but we don't like take ourselves too seriously. That's something that very much comes out when people meet us, but it's nice to get that brand out there more. And then what I love about doing the podcasts is I find I just learn a ton. I think it makes me better at my job to just be able to talk to the top people in AI and healthcare. I can just ask them whatever I want. I find I come away from those conversations just like much smarter about the spaces than I were before. So it's a lot of fun.
And I think Laura and I are very excited to hear your thoughts on healthcare and AI and learn from you kind of on the flip side here. So with that, would love to move into the state of AI in healthcare. Maybe could you just ground the group on your focus within healthcare and then maybe some areas that AI could potentially impact in the near term of the various healthcare streams?
We spend a lot of time in healthcare that has traditionally had not much to do with AI, right? I think there's a ton of really interesting stuff happening in value-based care, and we've invested in companies like Cityblock and Strive and Galileo. In the employer health world, there's all these like amazing solutions that are coming out, and we're investors in like Collective Health and JustWorks and Garner, consumer health, and companies like Hims and Ten. So we spend times in lots of spaces that are not directly AI. But there's no doubt the stuff that's happening in AI right now is incredibly exciting in healthcare. Broadly, a few different areas that are exciting for us. One space that has just really been taking off is the AI scribe space. Essentially, this is the idea that you can have a patient visit a physician, record that visit, and then generate a note from that visit so that it saves the doctor time. You can generate a summary that you bring back to the patient that helps them understand what to do. Maybe you send the next doctor, they go see some information about that patient. If you think about it, I mean, probably everyone listening to this podcast has gone to the doctor before, and the doctor is just like kind of talking to you, but really just like sitting and typing up a note. No, nobody wants to be doing that. It's certainly not how our health system should be designed. For a while, that's kind of what was required. I think what's really cool about these scribe technologies, where they basically listen in on the visits and then use these AI models to summarize those visits and kind of write the notes, is they're the first technology I've seen that really can solve that dream of getting the doctor out of focusing on the computer and into focusing more directly on the patient. And so that's been incredible just to see that technology progress and the way it's been adopted. There's really cool technology on like diagnoses and things that clinicians use to figure out what types of treatments to give patients and what types of disease folks might have. And then just, in the blood and guts of healthcare, there's so much money we spend on healthcare operations. And there's some really interesting companies that are helping automate some of those operations with AI. And so there's just so much happening in the space right now. It's really cool. Not to mention all the drug discovery stuff, which is like the really wild, like sci-fi type advances that are happening.
To your point on automating the scribe portion, I think doctors have notoriously bad handwriting. Firsthand, seeing that is very useful.
As someone with terrible handwriting too, I can certainly empathize. It's good to have that.
Yeah, we need that digitalized. I would actually love to move into the drug discovery and impact that this can actually have on medicine. Obviously, the scribe and understanding communication, you could almost call it between the doctor and patient, is really important. And it's a more near-term application of these tools that have come out. But I think as you think of what's going to be most impactful to society, actually changing the amount of time it takes to discover and bring a drug through phase 2 and phase 3 has incredible implications to the human race. So would love to just move into that space because I find it fascinating and just kind of hear your thoughts and what you're seeing as an early growth investor.
It's a really cool space. There's just a tremendous amount of talent flowing into the space. Like you have one of the Transformer paper authors, which is like the seminal paper in AI. Like he went and started this really cool company called Inceptive Bio that's building kind of foundation models for mRNA. And so there's both just incredible talent coming into the space. And then the progress that's being made is really mind blowing. One example I love is the diffusion models that power things like Midjourney or tools that you might have seen, all the cool images that created on the internet. Similar type models are actually quite effective for exploring new types of proteins that might be effective for drugs. And so you're seeing a lot of the advances that are happening in other parts of AI really influence drug discovery as well. And so it's been really exciting to see some of these models applied to both expand the types of potential treatments that are being tried and also make a much quicker feedback loop on what parts of those treatments are more or less effective. And so I think every startup, but also incumbent large pharmaceutical company is thinking about this right now. And there's been a first wave of companies like Recursion, probably chief among them, that have already had some success and spun off like a next generation of folks that were in those environments. And so what I think is really exciting is you have this set of people that know life sciences and drug discovery really well, but they also know AI really well. And when you combine those two together, the things they can do is just super exciting. I see a ton of pitches at our stage that are focused on that. And it just feels like the pace of change in that space is really, and to your point, has just a tremendous potential to really move the needle on human lifespan, which hard to get more exciting mission than that.
And particularly, it's speeding up the time in between a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and essentially getting it from discovery to FDA approval, right, is one of the key applications. Instead of taking a year, 2 years, 3 years, it can theoretically be done in days. And I'm curious to hear if you've come across any interesting companies or what technology is needed in order to kind of speed up that approval kind of trial process, if you spend time there.
The value prop's probably twofold, right? It's both to bring things to market faster and then also to not spend so much time on things that might not work, right? And know earlier, which does make things faster because you're spending time on the stuff that does have a higher chance of working. The time to market is, I guess I'll give the bull case and the bear case. Shortening the time to market is always going to be somewhat difficult because ultimately to really know if a drug works, you have to see it over a long period of time in humans, first mice, usually then humans. You can't shortcut that part. Like that just takes a certain amount of time. But what I think you can do is get earlier indications of what treatments might actually be effective and early signs of if they're not going to work. So you're not prioritizing things that aren't going to work in those trials. And then also just finding things that are going to have a much larger effect size early on. And so some of the coolest stuff I'm seeing, I mentioned these diffusion models in protein generation. I just think it's so fascinating. It's basically the idea of these companies is to date, the kinds of compounds we try as drugs is kind of limited by what compounds have worked before, what are things we know how to make, and are kind of limited by just scientists' intuition of what might work. And what's really cool about these diffusion models is they just give a ton of different ideas of what might be possible. And some of them are crazy, but some of them are things that like you wouldn't have thought of otherwise and actually might end up. So I just think there's this whole universe of compounds that we'll come across that are actually quite effective that we never would have known about without these kinds of models. That has tremendous potential to just make more effective therapies. And that would just be awesome to see.
And I'm sure there are implications to this. You're improving the success rate of drugs and stuff like that. I'm sure there's implications to the success of public healthcare companies that are developing these such drugs, right? Yeah.
In a similar vein would be clinical trials. Early last year, I think we really saw a moment of like AI impacting the clinical trial space, just speeding up the trial itself, patient matching. However, it still seems to be a bit of a saturated space, and I'm not sure who's really sorted through the noise. Have you seen that on your end, or have you found a true winner there with the implication of AI on clinical trials?
It's a really interesting space, one we're tracking closely. I guess to give a shout out to one company that I think is doing really cool work is this company Unlearn AI. It's probably the coolest application of AI I've seen on the trial side. What they're basically saying, which has always resonated, is look, in any given trial, the hardest part is recruiting patients. That's what takes the longest amount of time. But the reality is half of the patients in a trial just get the control arm. They get standard of care. It's important, obviously, to study the efficacy of a trial, but it feels intuitively like there should be some better way to do that. People have tried different things, like a Flatiron. We worked on what's called real-world control arms, which is like an alternative to control groups. But what this company Unlearn is doing is they're basically simulating the control arm. And they're saying, essentially, instead of having to recruit an entire group of people just to get what the normal standard of care that patients get, we have tons of data about how patients perform in getting the standard of care treatments they get. What if we use that data to build models and then use those models to essentially simulate what the control group would do? And so if you think about the potential implications of this, they're crazy. I mean, even just in the trial space, the potential implications are exciting because you can imagine running trials where you just need less people. Again, that to me directly correlates to a shorter time frame, because the biggest barrier to running trials is actually recruiting and getting enough patients to come in. So if you need less people, and if everybody in the trial is getting the treatment, that's incredibly powerful. But down the line, these things are called digital twins, where essentially for the same patient, you can simulate what might happen under different treatments. I mean, you could think about for us, when we're considering what treatments to get, just normally in your day-to-day, imagine you could simulate different results and be like, well, a patient that looks like Laura or Jacob, this is what happens to them under different treatments they might undergo. It's really cool technology. So I think that's one that definitely caught my eye.
But do you see clinicians adopting some of these super innovative newer AI practices? Because they're pretty far reaching. And I mean, the technology adoption can be lagging. So do you see the adoption rate increasing or kind of, trickling towards where it needs to be?
It's still early days. And to be clear, that company I just described, they're not quite at that full vision. And so I think there's some really powerful clinical workflows out there. And some companies like Viz.ai or AI Doc have had a lot of success getting folks to adopt these solutions. But it requires today a really smart go-to-market where you're getting the health system something they want, and the clinician something that benefits them, and obviously the patient something that benefits them. And so I think the best AI and healthcare companies provide incredible patient impact and clinical impact, but they also are able to marry that with a go-to-market that kind of benefits the different stakeholders in the system. And so I think over time, though, I'm sure this stuff will get adopted because the results are just so good.
So I'd love to move to grounding the group on what value-based healthcare is, because it's a really important transition and trend that's happening. Could you just quickly, in your own words, describe what is value-based care and why is it disruptive?
People usually contrast value-based care with fee-for-service, which is like the traditional way of paying for healthcare. And what all that means is fee-for-service just means every individual thing you do, you get paid for. So we'll take me as the patient. Like if I go have a visit with my doctor, okay, that gets charged. And if I get a blood test at that visit, that gets charged. And then I have a surgery, that gets charged. And that's each individual item is charged for. And that's traditionally how we pay for healthcare in this country. What value-based care says is, what if instead of paying for each individual thing that happens to Jacob, we said, in a normal year, Jacob's going to cost the healthcare system $5,000. And so instead of paying for each thing that happens to Jacob, we're going to give you $5,000 to take care of Jacob. And if you're able to save money from that, great, you'll make money. And if he's more expensive, you basically take on the risk of what happens there. But I think why that's exciting for people is if you think about the incentives, in a world in which you get paid to do every extra test on Jacob and every, I guess, apologies for talking about myself in the third person as the patient, but you get the idea. In a world in which you get paid for every extra test you do, there's kind of an incentive to just do more. And a lot of that might not actually be that valuable or helpful to the healthcare system. And also, there's not really an incentive to intervene preemptively and stop something from turning into a much more serious healthcare problem. And I think what gets people excited about value-based care is if you're on the hook for the entire spend for someone for the year, there's a real incentive to both only provide care that's necessary, but also provide some of that preemptive care that might help you avoid some of the more expensive stuff down the line.
Why are we seeing this shift today? It seems like something that should have been implemented years ago. Why is it that up until now or in recent time, we've had the fee-for-service model?
There were waves of it being tried in the 1990s with like managed care. I do think a few things have changed to make it like an interesting why now for the market, right? The first is, government policy really drives a lot in healthcare. And the government has been leaning into, through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, as well as just broader Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they've been introducing a lot of these models that are value-based care models. In some ways, they have this thing called Medicare Advantage, which is Medicare plans that are run by private insurers. And that is basically giving the risk of a Medicare life to a third-party insurance body. And then they have had models for kidney care. They've had models for all sorts of different things that folks have tried. They have this new model called ACO Reach that's like value-based care for primary care. And so a lot of like value-based care gets driven by government policy. And the second thing I'd say is that there's been some early success stories, like company like Agilon and Oak Street Health have done a really good job showing that you can build a really interesting business, and one that patients love, one that saves money for the healthcare system. And given that model, I think there's a lot more receptivity in the ecosystem to say, hey, maybe we should try this more.
Given the focus on preemptive care, what have been the implications that you've seen on actual technology and medical practices that are occurring? Are there now more startups in the preemptive space? What has been the impact on maybe adoption of monitoring technology as opposed to kind of reactive care?
Yeah, it's a great question, because basically like what value-based care does is it shifts what you have to do. You have to basically manage a whole population, and you have to know who's at risk for certain things, when might things get escalated. And that's actually a place where technology can be super helpful in helping oversee, helping prioritize who are the right patients to contact, when, what are the right warning signs to know when you should be getting in touch with someone. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to build technology there, as well as you were kind of alluding to some of this like remote patient monitoring technology, or ways to just have more frequent touch points with patients. If I think about the fundamental thing that makes a value-based care company successful, it's just having more touch points with patients and being able to build trust with those patients, engage those patients, and intervene early before health problems get worse.
And I think something that is top of mind for whether you're selling it to hospitals, payers, employers is the costs associated. What's the financial benefit for health systems? Is it only employers? Can like both of these worlds coexist?
The benefit for employers and payers is pretty clear. It does save money. When these models work, they save money for the system. And so that's great for anyone that's paying for care. For health systems, it's an interesting question. Like, obviously, a lot of health systems do quite well under fee for service. And so I think one of the big questions in broader healthcare over the next decade or two will be, how do you kind of appropriately incentivize and transition some of these health systems to want to do more in value-based care? I'd say across the spectrum, there's some organizations, some health systems, some provider groups are like so all in on value-based care, and they're like they're doing everything they can to move toward it because they see like that's a model that really works for them. But that's not true of every medical practice in the country. And so it's a policy challenge, it's a startup challenge. Like, how do you make it so there's more and more incentives for folks to switch? And there's sticks and carrots to that. On the carrot side, you can make these models attractive. You can provide technology that helps these folks succeed. The stick side, which people talk about on the policy lever, is at some point, do you just require people to take on some of this risk?
We were listening to some of your episodes doing research for the podcast, and you mentioned when pitching to a hospital system, it needs to be one of the 2 to 3 things that are like top of mind. So for them, what's top of mind right now for hospital systems that they're really looking at in the market?
I'm going to say labor, labor, and labor. There is huge staff shortages for nurses, for doctors right now, for just administrators. And obviously, I think there's been a tremendous problem with physician and clinician burnout. Health systems are super focused on how do they survive in this challenging labor environment. And I think that, again, that's a place where technology has a ton of potential to help with both augmenting existing labor forces that are out there, but also just improving the quality of life for folks that work in these systems. A lot of these folks are really underserved by technology today. And I think it makes the day-to-days of these jobs incredibly difficult.
Putting healthcare aside for a second, Jacob, I know you focus just on general kind of AI applications, and I'd love to just probe the area of AGI with you, because it's something that fascinates me and kind of nebulous, right? Like no one really knows what the definition would be and when we can actually achieve it, if we can achieve it. So I'd love to just get your take on what do you view as AGI to start?
AGI is when we have a model that can do everything a human can do at, I'd say, at the quality of the median human, the top quartile human, I don't know, some level of human quality across the incredibly broad swath of things that we're able to do as humans.
How would you define being able to achieve that? If you were a startup looking to achieve AGI, what milestone would you need to reach in order to say, okay, we have a product that actually is AGI?
A big part of it is just the breadth of what you're able to do. And to some extent, the transferability of what you're doing. Part of what that looks like is being exposed to some sort of brand new situation that a human might be exposed to, and knowing how to navigate or work around that. And so I think to find that in contrast to models or companies that are focused on achieving one very specific task. There's many things that are amazing about humanity, but one of them is just our ability to do the generalizability of what we're able to do and across so many different kinds of things. And I think that's one thing that's been so cool about the first wave of these models is they're way more generalizable than past iterations of AI, but I still think there's obviously a long way to go. I mean, you see the silly ways in which something like ChatGPT slips up today. There's a good way to go.
And of course, for listeners, it's artificial general intelligence is AGI. Last question on this topic is I'd love to just hear, there are hundreds of thousands of applications that you could kind of use AGI for. What are maybe one or two that you're particularly excited about?
The ones that get me most excited from a mission perspective are like, just what we'll be able to do with drug discovery and the amount of progress we'll make there, as well as education, right? I just think there'll be so much potential, and you're already starting to see some of it, to just tremendously both personalize education for different folks and also just democratize access to the kind of best quality individual one-on-one tutoring that only select few get today. Just being able to scale that to so many folks. I mean, I guess mental health too, like all these things that exist today in some but are constrained by supply. And we know what like really good looks like, but it's not like scalable to a broad set of people. I think is just tremendously exciting. The potential that these models have to help there. I think on the more fun side, I love these generative image and video models are just so much fun. The idea that like in the future, you can dream up any kind of story with any kind of characters, yourselves, your friends, and some superhero too, and just spin it up whenever you want. I'm excited for that one. I think it's going to be really fun. I'm just every day blown away by the pace at which the stuff changes and the quality of some of these models. It's really cool.
How early is too early for Redpoint to invest in some of these ideas or companies that are being built?
I'd say nothing is too early. We've invested in people that are just thinking about an idea. The quality of folks that are going into this and the quality of the teams. We look a lot at founder market fit, and is this the right team to be building in that space? But there's some just incredibly exciting teams kind of getting started in the AI space. And I think those are really interesting investments.
What are your top 3 founder attributes that you look for when evaluating a team?
First, I'd say is just a real passion and connection to the problem they're working on. And so building a startup is so hard, as all the inevitable things that come up that are just incredibly difficult over the course of the multi-decade journey that comes in building these companies. Was this something that both deeply resonates with the individual, but also it feels like they're the right person to go build that company? And you're like, of course, it makes sense that person is solving this kind of problem. The second is just ability to run through walls. You just meet some of these people, you're like, this person will win. I just feel like there's no world in which I feel like this person won't figure out whatever her stuff comes up. And then the third is, storytelling and being able to tell. Obviously, so much of a job of a founder is convincing early customers to come on when the product's still pretty nascent, or early employees who can make more money elsewhere, or investors to invest. People that can do that well is just such an awesome superpower. And I guess because I just thought about it on the spot, the fourth one I'd add too is my favorite founder meetings are the ones where you just learn, someone has just thought so deeply about a market that you learn that like wedge they have or the insight they have about that market is just special. And you're like, that makes a ton of sense. I never would have thought about it like that, but just shows, again, someone being super deep in a space and really understanding it.
Well, Jacob, this has been an awesome conversation. And to wrap, we have 2 questions for you. And the first one is, what motivates you to work hard?
Venture is like an absurdly fun job, right? Like I really enjoy what I do. So I find it fun, first of all. Like a lot of times it doesn't feel like work. And then second of all, I mean, I really believe in the companies that we work with. What they're doing is incredibly powerful. The missions they have, the products they ship. And so getting to be a small part and helping where we can is incredibly motivating.
And then what's a piece of advice that you'd give your younger self?
Paying attention to what gives you energy. So much of what I've seen of people who do well in their careers and people who do well in venture is finding what the intersection of things that are helpful to your career, but also the things that you really enjoy doing. For example, even the podcasts are a great example. I find that stuff super fun. I ran a political magazine in college where I just interviewed a bunch of people. And so looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that's something I've always enjoyed. As you guys well know, running a podcast is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it does take a fair amount of time. And so, but I think if it's something you enjoy, I think a lot of it is just figuring out the things you really enjoy, because odds are, that stuff you'll be good at.
I think this has been a very energizing and passionate episode. I think your love for venture and what you do is clearly shown in display, just given your responses today. Thanks for coming on and chatting with us, and appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks for the great questions.